The United States had a concerted effort, deployed naval assets, et cetera, to be able to stop that. That was very successful. Again, not all that difficult to be able to patrol your coastline and everything else. You're looking for speedboats. You're looking for, low-flying planes. It's not all that difficult to be able to put a stop to it. So that was largely interdicted, and that had a huge impact on the ability of these organizations to be able to move that product across borders. Then what ended up happening is that the value chain moved, because when you're dealing with these type of organizations and anything having to relate to this sort of trafficking world and all of that, the value is in moving that product from point A to point B. So now moving it from point A was more difficult. So now you needed a different conduit, a different route. And that's where Mexico stepped in. So Mexico has the 8th largest border in the world. So the U.S.-Mexico border, 8th largest in the world, 2,000 miles long. Again, massive border. Much of it is completely unsupervised. It's completely empty. You have huge stretches of desert. Then you have rivers, and then you have urban areas. Really complex border, very large border, and again, a very large border. So the value then came not from the Colombians themselves, but from the Colombians bringing it to Mexico, where then the Mexican organizations were then going to be the ones to traffic that contraband into the U.S. So that's where that value and that profitability really sort of rose significantly for the Mexican organizations. So the Colombian organizations, in comparison, decreased in their relative value, while the Mexican organizations proved to be the most valuable part of that chain. So you can almost think about it like when Apple is making an iPhone, you have the people who are producing the phone, then you have the people who are shipping the phone. But at the end of the day, Apple, the company, the ones marketing the product, bringing the product together, engineering the product, and eventually selling the product is where most of the value is. You can almost think of the Mexican cartels the same way. So all this sort of contraband, all of this material was then coming through Mexico. These organizations then began to fight over the routes to be able to bring that into the United States. And again, what we've seen over the last 20, 25 years is an explosion of violence in Mexico, as that's now been the heart of where the value chain is in the drug trafficking from South America into the United States. So what we've seen there is, again, a number of organizations rise and fall, but again, almost always some level of conflict over these major routes. So again, that's made cities like Tijuana, right on the U.S. border. It's made cities like Matamoros and some of these other that are right along the border, some of the most dangerous cities in the world. Anywhere where there's sort of a valuable trade route or trafficking route, these areas have seen tremendous amounts of violence and a lot of fighting between the cartels to establish dominance and to be able to reap the profits of, again, a very profitable drug trade. So then what we've seen is that, okay, the Americans have, before I get into that, so again, if you want to think even more broadly about this border and why it's so difficult to police relative to, again, the Gulf of Mexico and some of the other efforts that the American government has made, you're talking about a border, again, I mentioned the 8th largest border in the world. It's also crossed by 400 million people a year. 400 million people come across that border on an annual basis. Over 100 million cars. There's $800 billion of trade between the U.S. and Mexico. It's the most lucrative and largest bilateral trade relationship on the planet. $1.5 billion a day is generated from these cross-border activities. So you're talking about how do you then stop that, right? I mean, it could be as simple as people, 400 million of them who cross the border every day could be involved in this. You're talking about 100 million vehicles. How do you inspect all those vehicles? It's a Herculean challenge that, of course, hasn't been solved, and there really hasn't been a solution to it up to this point. So again, that's driven a lot of the violence. That's driven the rise of some of these cartels. That's driven the rise of these cartels to align themselves with some of the organizations in Colombia, for example, and to then really assert their dominance on the industry. And again, now the problem that you have is the longer that these organizations are able to thrive, what you're now seeing is that the relationship to Europe, there's a lot of obviously export from Mexico to Europe of these same drugs, of these same contraband and whatnot. So you've had this sort of metastasization of the problem as it's moved to Mexico. So then what you have is the question of American strategy, and this is the question that the article raises, is is American policy to blame or is somehow involved in what's happening? So the U.S. has adopted what's been called the kingpin strategy, and it's had this strategy now for a number of decades, where the U.S. will go after and target some of the leaders of these organizations, bring them to justice, extradite them to the U.S. So again, El Chapo is sitting in a prison in the U.S. You had a lot of the associates of the Medellin cartel from the 80s. You've had a lot of the associates of some of the older Mexican cartels still sitting in prison in the United States. And the idea being that the Americans will disincentivize the leadership to pursue these actions, activities, whatever, in an effort to try to dampen the trade. All that's happened is that the trade has exploded. So for example, I have a data point here, if I can just pull it up. So for example, if you're looking at global cocaine production, and we're only talking about this one drug because of its profitability, but there's a lot of other drugs and a lot of other illegal activities that these organizations have really thrived participating in. But cocaine production in 1994 was 891 metric tons. 2021, it was 2,300 metric tons. So you're talking about almost a tripling in the production and cultivation of cocaine, okay? So clearly whatever's been tried hasn't been working, and the problem is only metastasizing, as I said. So then you've got the American policy of trying to take out these leaders. And that's exactly what happened over the summer, which is where this article came from. So you've had the largest organization in Mexico, the most successful drug cartel, probably everybody's heard of it, the Sinaloa cartel. So again, it was headed by a guy named El Chapo, who I think most people know, who's now in prison in the U.S. And one of his associates was a guy named Almayo Zambada. So finally, the U.S. was able to capture this guy. They've been looking for him for maybe 30 or 40 years. They arrested him over the summer back in July. The result of that, rather than bringing peace, rather than controlling the drug issue or the drug conflict, has led to massive violence that's broken out in that state of Sinaloa where the cartel is headquartered. So you've now had a relative splintering of the group where now you've got these two groups fighting each other. El Chapo's former associates, and then you have El Mayo's former associates. So all that's been accomplished by that action, which was to arrest Almayo Zambada, has been this explosion in violence in Sinaloa. And you see that in most situations in Mexico. When you've had these major arrests, when you've brought down one cartel, there's only another cartel that comes in to fill the void. So we've seen that historically in the 50 years since the drug war's begun, that's always where it goes. So arresting a leader, trying to do something about this issue rarely actually leads to the solution, but instead typically ends in more violence. So we've historically seen when you've had maybe one cartel, one successful cartel, that's typically when violence is maybe reduced, but it's the rivalry itself, the inter-gang warfare, where you have a lot of this issue, which is causing the violence to metastasize. So what we've seen in particular, so you've had, for example, in 2020, it was the deadliest year in Mexico. 2021 was even deadlier than that. So Mexico's almost on an annual, 2019 had been the deadliest year in Mexico. You've seen on almost an annual basis, the violence continues to metastasize and continues to get worse. And it's driven by these massive profits that could be gained. Again, cocaine was the foundation of it, but now you have a larger problem. Now you have the issue of fentanyl, for example, which is causing a huge political issue in the U.S. because of how deadly it is and how that's now contaminated a lot of the illegal, but also some of the legal drugs. And again, a lot of that's coming from Mexico. So between obviously other types of illicit activity, human trafficking, these organizations continue to get more and more powerful, continue to grow in their size and influence and financial resources. And again, that violence is only getting worse. Which then brings us to the initial question, which is this going to go anywhere? Is there any future for combating the drug violence? So again, I think I've laid out by and large where this has come from, where we are today, sort of how things look from a macro perspective. And again, the reason why I'm so pessimistic, and I would say absolutely not, I don't think there's any hope of this ending anytime soon, is if you go even larger than that. So we talked about the profitability, we talked about the why the Mexican trade routes are so important. But if you go into the actual revenue these organizations make, the size and scope of these organizations, this data is very hard to come by, but there's a lot of estimates that have been made. So in Mexico, for example, you're talking about a country where people wonder, how is it that such criminality can exist? How is it that they can't really get a hold on the issue? It's very simple, and it's really, I think, even no fault of Mexico, to be honest. If you look at the largest companies in Mexico by revenue, just as an example. So Pemex, which is the state oil company in Mexico, largest company by revenue substantially, they make $92 billion a year in revenue. Again, that's the state oil company for a major oil producing country in Mexico. The number two company in the country is Walmart Mexico, which makes $52 billion a year. And then the third is something called América Móvil, which is a telecom company owned by Carlos Slim, one of the richest guys in the world, $48 billion of revenue per year. Now, if you look at how much the drug cartels in Mexico make, and you add all that revenue up, again, these estimates are relatively imprecise. They're only estimates because these guys obviously don't report their finances. They're not audited by anybody. But you're looking at roughly $50 billion a year in revenue for these drug cartels, for these criminal organizations. That would rank them the second or third largest company in Mexico. So how are you going to handle that problem if the second or third largest company in your country, again, is making that money on a fully illicit basis, all of their revenue, all of their products, all of their services, if you want to sort of compare them to a corporation, are illegal? Obviously, that's a huge problem for them. If you then look at also the how many people they employ. So again, people think about, well, can't you just arrest everybody? Direct employees of these criminal organizations, again, by estimates, are 175,000 people, which would make them the fifth largest employer in Mexico. That's direct members of the organization. That doesn't count the people that they're paying or paying off or bribing or whatever the case is. So once you think about it in those terms, this would be the second or third largest company in Mexico, the fifth largest direct employer, and possibly the largest if you consider the people that they're paying off, the people who are somehow related to the business. You're talking about a Herculean problem. How are you going to grapple with that? How are you going to get your hands around that? I don't see how you can.